In this lecture, I plan to deal with Alexander's conquest of Iran. And that's in a rather extended use of the term because ancient Iran would have embraced most of what is today modern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, those republics that were once part of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, in the Central Asiatic regions, today the desert and steppes of Central Asia, the people dwelling there spoke Iranian languages rather than Turkish languages. Turkish speakers arrived in the early Middle Ages. So Iran, in its greatest sense, meant not only the modern area of Iran, but a good deal of what is today Central Asia. It was a daunting task. And I last concluded with Alexander in control of the great cities of Persia proper, that is today southwestern Iran, and ready to move out in early 330 BC to capture King Darius. The capture of Darius III would end the war. Alexander already had the family of Darius, and some of the leading Persian nobles were beginning to come over to Alexander's side. Darius was attempting to organize an army at the city of Ecbatana, which is today more or less modern Hamadan, a great caravan center in northwestern Iran, and well known for its famous mosques in the early modern period. However, Darius was really short of money. He had perhaps at most 4,000 Greek hoplite mercenaries who were devoted to his cause. These are men who had been in his service for many years. But he depended on those nobles from the upper satrapies, that is, from what is today Central Asia, Bactria and Sogdiana, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, because they had most of the military forces at this point. Bessus alone commanded some 3,300 cataphracti, and he pretty much was calling the shots along with several other senior aristocrats. Alexander moved swiftly. He sent out advanced work teams and engineers literally to cut paths in the ice across the formidable mountain ranges that divide Iran from Mesopotamia to give him a clear route to Ecbatana. And he set off with the usual strike force, a force that became quite common in the later campaigns. And that was a force that composed of the cavalry, the companion cavalry, several of the light cavalry units, the Agrianians, archers, select regiments of the phalanx, and the hypacipists. And this was generally a strike force of some 15,000 men. They were all the best and strongest of the Macedonian army, and they could move faster than the rest of the army. He moved over that prepared position, literally when there was still ice on the ground. Behind him followed the main army with Parmenio, and that included some 180,000 talents worth of gold and silver being conveyed by mules and camels. I think 5,000 camels and 20,000 mules were pressed into service, and essentially the Macedonian court, which went at a slower pace. Alexander reached Ecbatana at record time, but he missed Darius III. Darius had been alerted to the movement. He was very surprised. He fled east along the caravan routes just south of the Caspian Sea. He went with his Greek mercenaries and those of the cavalry forces he had collected, but he really had no army to oppose Alex, not even Alex's strike force. At Ecbatana, Alexander made several important decisions. First, Parmenio was probably in his mid to late 60s at this point, and Alexander turned over to Parmenio the great treasury and a military force of great size. It's still hard to know how many forces. Some would argue as many as 15 to 20,000 men, largely mercenaries and other men who were pensioned off because they really weren't fit for the campaigns to the east. They were to be centered at Ecbatana, the capital of the ancient region of Media. The treasury was located there. And if one observes the map, you can see what it is. Alexander had now placed the third of Philip's great senior generals in charge of a very important region that protected his lines of communications back to Macedon. So you have Parmenio in Media at Ecbatana, Antigonus the One-Eyed controlling Asia Minor, and Antipater back in Macedon. And this would allow the march of Greek mercenaries and Macedonian reinforcements. Second, Alexander announced to the army that the Pan-Hellenic War was over. The burning of Persepolis, perhaps a couple of months earlier, symbolized that. Now he dismissed all those Greeks fighting under the terms of the Hellenic League. This included the Thessalian cavalry, some 2,000 men, who were essentially regarded as the equivalent of the companions, and they had to be replaced with other cavalry forces. And Alexander, in the next several years, reorganized his whole cavalry formation along new lines. Some of the Greek mercenaries signed up, some of the Greek allies signed up as mercenaries. Some of them went home. They were well paid. They were discharged. And the Thessalians all made it back home, where some of them later joined in the Lamian War against Alex. The Greeks back home were really taken aback by all of this news. And Diodorus Siculus, and it's useful sometimes to turn to this account, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, had access to sources that saw the whole career of Alexander from the Greek and Persian perspective. And as a notice as to what the impact of the Battle of Arbela had, or the Battle of Gaugamela, and also Alexander's burning of Persepolis and the dismissal of his Greek allies, is driven home by an excerpt that I wish to read. In this year, word was brought to Greece, this is in 330 BC, about the battle near Arbela, that's Gaugamela, and many of the cities became alarmed at the growth of Macedonian power and decided that they would strike for their freedom while the Persian cause was still alive. They expected that Darius would help them and send them much money so that they could gather great armies of mercenaries. You notice the Greek city-states are no longer thinking in terms of citizen armies, while Alexander would not be able to divide his forces. If, on the other hand, they watched idly while the Persians were utterly defeated, the Greeks would be isolated and never again be able to think of recovering their freedom. Well, the words are well taken, and Alexander understood this in the spring of 330, and that's why he struck east in pursuit of Darius, not only to conquer the Persian Empire, but to remove any doubt in the minds of his Greek allies that there was a Persian king who could assist those elements in the Greek world that wanted to restore the city-state order as it had existed before the Battle of Chaeronea. And in 330 BC, with the death of Darius, I mean, that option is closed. The Greeks at that point will never make another move again until Alexander is dead in 323 BC. The pursuit of Darius across northern Iran is really one of the most dramatic events in Arrian's account. There are very detailed information. There is very detailed information on the route of that pursuit, and Alexander divided his forces into essentially 3 columns. There were the forces with Parmenio that included the siege train, many of the mercenaries and the treasury, and some of those forces later rejoined Alexander. There was a large force put under the command of Craterus. I've mentioned him before. Craterus had been a taxiarch. He had been one of the best commanders of a regiment of the phalanx. He had distinguished himself at Gaugamela, showing initiative. He was wounded, and his bravery was unquestioned. Craterus was elevated from a commander of the phalanx to essentially Parmenio's position. He was now second in command. Craterus was, of course, of noble origin, and he was more or less the same age as Alexander, and it's another example of how Alexander got the best out of his nobles and promoting men based on their merit. Craterus took some 30,000 men or more. That were the slower elements, while Alexander put together a strike force of some 15 to 20,000 men and went off in pursuit at fast pace. He followed the various caravan routes in pursuit of Darius and made for what is today the caravan town of Kazvin, and from there moved to the ancient city of Ragai, heading for what are known as the southern Caspian Gates. This is a great pass that allows entrance into northern Iran and into south of the Caspian Sea. And he knew that the only route that the Persians could take was essentially to skirt along between the mountains and the fertile areas north of that great desert that dominates central Iran. What he didn't know at first is that Darius had been deposed, that the nobles around Darius were now fed up, that Bessus and a fellow by the name of Barsainates, who was satrap of Dragiana, which is one of the important satrapies of southeastern Iran, that's where Alexander will winter in 330, 329 BC, that they both had essentially arrested Darius, stripped him of his power, and Bessus eventually was proclaimed king in Bactria under the name of Artaxerxes V. Darius was in chains. This had troubled many of the members of this decreasing army, and it led many of the Persian aristocrats of what I would call the imperial rank, that is, the great families who served at Susa and Persepolis, to question whether they would want to follow these eastern lords, Bessus and his crowd, who were really seen as something as outlanders. They were essentially frontier barons. Yes, they were noble, but they were not of the inner clique. Furthermore, the Greek mercenaries were very disturbed, and many of them began to desert. And as Alexander pressed after that Persian force, he was informed that Darius was arrested. He also had every bit of evidence that the Persian army was in complete moral collapse. Some historians have censured Alexander for recklessness, foolhardiness, and pursuing at the pace he did, because by the time Alexander caught up with this Persian force, according to one source, he only had 60 mounted men, and there were a lot more Persians in the camp around Bessus and the soon-to-be murdered Darius than in Alexander's ranks. But Alexander could see that the Persian army was falling apart. There were discarded chariots and carts, equipment. There were numerous deserters. Greek mercenaries in small groups were deserting. They informed Alexander that Darius had been captured, had been arrested, and actually Alexander did not punish these mercenaries because they showed loyalty to their king, Darius, and Alexander approved of that. He pushed on relentlessly. He tried to close the gap because the Persians had a very far advance. He made it to a town called Aradon, just beyond the Caspian Gates, and there he gathered supplies, and he was getting ready to reorganize his forces when he received news that the army of Bessus was just a couple of days away. He set off in pursuit with his strike force. According to Arrian, he covered some 35 miles in 24 hours. By traveling at night, rested his army, and then was informed by more deserters that Bessus was now some 40 to 45 miles away, and this is where he found that dry riverbed and covered nearly 45 miles in the course of an evening march. He had essentially 500 mounted infantrymen, of whom only about 60 were with him, and sometime in mid-July of 330 BC, Alexander at dawn popped up over a hill, found the Persian camp, and charged. It was audacity and surprise that delivered him victory. Bessus and his friends scattered immediately. Darius was slain so he wouldn't fall into Alexander's hands. It was a stunning pursuit, and the distances and speeds attained by Alexander were never to be exceeded again by armies really until the Napoleonic Age. But again, these were special strike forces moving at rapid speed. The capture of that camp had the effect expected. Many of the great Persian nobles now came over to Alexander. And these included, first and foremost, Artabazus, who had been satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, at this point was one of the senior men in the Persian aristocracy. He had actually been very briefly in exile at the court of King Philip. His daughter, Barsine, became, in effect, Alexander's mistress or pseudo-wife. They had a child later on, Heracles. Oxyathres, the brother of Darius III, also came over. And Oxyathres' defection to Alexander was very important because he was a member of the Achaemenid house, and many senior satraps now came in and offered their services to Alexander, and of course he rewarded them with positions. By 330 BC or 329 BC, there were some 10 major satrapies in Alexander's hands. 5 of them were staffed by senior Persians who essentially took over the civil administration. At that point, Alexander had a lot more legitimacy than did Bessus. The death of Darius, by some, has been argued as really an advantage for Alexander, that he would have been embarrassed if he had captured the great king. I mean, what do you do with Darius III? Especially if Darius had beseeched Alexander as a suppliant, that is, had asked for mercy. And I think that Alexander probably would have treated Darius quite courteously. In later antiquity, there was always a delightful exercise for schoolboys, which in effect said that, well, Alexander didn't find Darius dead, he was dying, and recreate a conversation between Alex and Darius on the nature of human fortune or of kingship or a number of different subjects, because Darius was seen in many ways as a noble king. I would like to read the assessment that Arrian gives on Darius, and it's a rather mixed picture, and it shows some of Arrian's prejudices as a Roman senator rather than as a Greek writer, because he sees Darius's heirs, the so-called Parthian kings, as Rome's enemies, so you have to filter a bit of that through this. But this is what Arrian states about Darius's career. Such was the end of Darius. He died in July during the archonship of Aristophon in Athens. That's our year of 330 BC. In military matters, he was the feeblest and most incompetent of men. In other spheres of his conduct, appears to have been moderate and decent. though the truth may well be that as his accession to the throne coincided with the declaration of war by Macedon and Greece, he had no opportunity to play the tyrant. And this is some of the Greek and Roman prejudices coming through about Eastern kings. In the circumstances, being himself in greater peril than his subjects, he could hardly have treated them with the usual cruelty of an Oriental despot. A little bit of editorializing by Arrian, even had he wished to do so. His life was an unbroken series of disasters from the moment of his accession to the throne. He was immediately faced by the defeat of his satraps and their mounted troops on the Granicus. The loss of Ionia and Aeolus swiftly followed with the two Phrygias, Lydia, and all Caria except Halicarnassus. Soon afterwards, Halicarnassus too was gone, and the whole coast as far as Cilicia. Then came his own defeat at Issus, and the bitter sight of his mother, wife, and children as prisoners in enemy hands. The loss of Phoenicia and Egypt was followed by the debacle at Arbela, that is the Battle of Gaugamela, his own shameful flight from the field, and the destruction of the mightiest army in the whole East. Then a homeless fugitive in the land he once ruled, ruthlessly betrayed by his own guards, a monarch in chains, contemptuously smuggled away from the scene of his former glory. He was finally murdered by the treachery of those most bound in duty to serve him. Such was the unhappy life of Darius. Dead, he was more fortunate, for he was buried in the royal tomb. His children were given by Alexander the same upbringing and education they would have had if he had still been king, and his daughter became Alexander's wife. He was about 50 when he died. A fitting testimony to Darius, and also an indication that Arrian understood clearly what that murder meant. It gave legitimacy to Alexander and in many ways turned Bessus into a rebel. Alexander appreciated this fact, and in the course of 330 and 329 BC, he received many important submissions from the Persian nobility. He knew now that his next task was to defeat Bessus. The Macedonian army perhaps was a bit disappointed. They would have thought that the death or the capture of Darius would have ended the war. However, the events, the way they played out in 330 BC, meant that Iran, which is today Iran and Afghanistan essentially, fell to Alexander's army within a year. No small achievement. In late summer of 330 BC, Alexander reunited most of his forces at a city called Susia, which is today the modern city of Tuz in Iran. And that is an important city in the province of Aria, the satrapy of Aria, and that satrapy would be the base for a drive into Central Asia. The satrap of that area, a man named Sati Barzanes, came over to Alexander. He submitted. He later rebelled in the year and had to be defeated and slain by a secondary column. But initially, Alexander thought by securing Aria and its neighboring satrapy to the north, Margiana, especially its city, which is today the modern city of Merv, that he had control of key caravan cities from which he could launch a strike across the Karakum Desert into Central Asia and hit Sogdiana, which is essentially the base of Bessus, Sogdiana and Bactria, which is today Central Asia, parts of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and end the war, capture Bessus and end the war in 330 BC. Unfortunately, that was not possible. There were two events that interrupted this game plan. One was the fact that the satrap in Aria, Sati Barzanes, rebelled late in the year. That rebellion had to be put down. Aria had to be reorganized under a Macedonian garrison, most of it's Greek mercenaries, but Macedonian officers. The second problem was the conspiracy of Philotas, which I'll be discussing in a separate lecture. And that conspiracy, our trial and execution of Philotas, is not quite sure what this conspiracy was, really divided the Macedonian military elite. It was a very ugly and damaging incident, and it occurred in late 330 BC at Frada, which is today Farah, a town in southwestern Afghanistan, in the region of the Helmand Valley. In any case, Alexander's plans of carrying out a strike from the west across the caravan cities into Central Asia had to be shelved. Bessus could rest assured that he had the winter to prepare for Alexander's attack, and in 330-329 BC, Bessus was proclaimed king by all the lords of Bactria and Sogdiana. He also made contact with the various nomadic tribes, loosely called Scythians. These are people who dwelled to the north and to the west of Sogdiana. They are in the desert and arid zones. They go by a number of names: Sakai, Dahai, Masagitai. The classical sources are really rather vague on who they are, but they are all Iranian speakers, and they were dreaded horse archers, and Bessus was confident that he could call upon these nomadic allies to beef up his own heavy cavalry and infantry from Bactria and Sogdiana. He was also counting on that tradition of independence that those lords had in Central Asia. To a large extent, the great king of Persia could rule these regions because he didn't ask too much from them, and he entrusted power into the local elites. Alexander had to defeat Bessus. It was a challenge that could not go unmatched. There had already been a revolt in Arya in 330 BC, and while many of the imperial aristocrats were coming over to Alexander's side, there is no doubt that the Iranians saw Alexander as an interloper, an invader. The Macedonians, now in Iran, were far from the Mediterranean world. They were moving through the lands of the imperial peoples of Persia, who had ruled the Near East. This was a very different type of war from conquering the Western satrapies, where generally the populations really had no particular loyalty to the great king, and in many instances had long ties with the Greeks. Alexander, therefore, wintered in the region which is known today as the Helmand Valley. It is a very fertile area in Afghanistan. It's actually a place where a lot of grain and poppies are grown today. And he decided to move strategically, and one wonders how he got all this information, not by striking into Central Asia across those caravan cities, but instead to take an indirect route. Essentially, it was the route from Kandahar to Kabul, well known by British armies such as John Keane in 1839 or Lord Frederick Roberts, Little Bob's, in 1879. And that is when the army was well rested in the spring of 329 BC, they followed these traditional routes across Afghanistan, crossed the Hindu Kush by one of several passes probably, and invaded from the southeast in a direction that Bessus was not prepared to match. And it's necessary to describe a bit the geography of this region of the Upper Satrapy, Central Asia. Bactria was one of the most fertile areas, and it was the region that was on the northern side, or the more or less northwestern side of the Hindu Kush, and south of the great Oxus River. And the Oxus River today is known as the Amu Darya. North of the Oxus River, stretching towards the desert regions and to the northeast to the Jaxartes River, today known as the Sir Darya, was a vast land known as Sogdiana. And it presented a land of mixed contrasts. There were a number of very, very important tributaries that flowed into the Oxus north to south and therefore watered Sogdiana. The Jaxartes to the northeast was a very important water source. Those are the upper parts of the Jaxartes River, which is fed by the mountains. And so Sogdiana was immediately to the north of Bactria. It was bounded by the mountains to the east, and to the north and to the west were the desert and arid zones, and the various nomadic peoples who were Iranian speakers were engaged in the caravan trade with the Sogdians and closely linked with caravan trade that eventually was developed all the way to China. So that these were extremely wealthy areas. The city of Bactra, today the modern city of Balkh, was clearly considered already a great city. The leading city in Sogdiana went by the name of Marakanda. It's in the general vicinity of the later medieval and modern commercial center, Samarkand. And so this is the region, the fabled region of Central Asia that has long been associated with the caravan trade that links China and the Far Eastern world, the world of the Han peoples, with the Middle East and Europe. So there was wealth there. There were great cities, there was plentiful supplies, but also a land that could sustain heavy cavalry among the Sogdians and Bactrians, plus all those marvelous nomadic allies that could be recruited who were related in speech and in some ways customs to the settled peoples. It was a tough area to pacify. Alexander, arriving early in 329 BC, overran Bactria with very little opposition. He occupied the city of Bactra, as opposed to the district of Bactria, and turned it into his base. They moved to the Oxus At least Bessus had the presence of mind to burn the bridges, but Alexander's forces simply crossed over by stuffing their tents in leather sacks with straw and floating across the Oxus the way they had done at the Danube back in 335 BC. The Macedonian army crossed in good order and began to pursue Bessus across Sogdiana. Very quickly, it became clear to the Sogdian lords that Bessus really couldn't oppose Alexander. The nomadic allies became very impatient. Bessus could not meet the Macedonian army on the battlefield. He really didn't want to plunder or burn the estates of the Sogdians, and so essentially the nomadic allies deserted because there was no plunder, there were no girls, nothing to sack. They fled back into the desert, and the Sogdian lords, notably two fellows, Spitamenes and Datafernes, who were the two leading barons in the region, grew impatient with Bessus and realized that it would be easier to deal with Alexander than this King Bessus, Artaxerxes V. They arrested Bessus, handed him over to Alexander, and expected that that would be the end of it. Bessus was taken back to Persia, and there's several accounts of his death. And it's said that Artabazus, the senior Persian noble, who was then made essentially satrap of Bactria and Sogdiana, that Artabazus actually presided over the execution and delighted in doing so because he blamed Bessus. He never forgave Bessus for killing Darius, and Bessus was stripped, mutilated, and impaled. And this was the customary punishment for going against the great king. And so what Alexander, in effect, did is turn Bessus over to his Persian nobility and say, you deal with this fellow the way you would deal with any kind of usurper. And it made clear to the Persian elites and to his Persian subjects that Alexander was now going to rule as Lord of Asia, as great king in his own right. So Bessus, in the end, I think the mutilation actually consisted of cutting off the eye, the nose and ears. It's a horrible death, and but one that was expected for a usurper. Meanwhile, in Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander went about ordering these new areas. He had just removed the pretender, the Artaxerxes V, the only royal opponent left to his title. And he noticed how important this region was. It is essentially the gateway to the caravan routes of Central Asia. It is also the bastion guarding the Persian heartland. And so he began to make certain administrative arrangements. He established a colony called Alexandria Escate, that is the farthest Alexandria. It's apparently on the Jaxartes River. There were other provisions being made to garrison Bactria and Sogdiana, to impose tribute, to settle some of the veterans, both Greeks and Macedonians, who were now wounded and unfit to go on. And that meant that there was going to be a presence, that the Macedonians were here to stay. The Macedonians themselves thought that the war is over. A little bit longer than they expected, and in fact, in their mind, they believed they had reached the ends of the world. The Jaxartes River, which flows into the Aral Sea, that great inland lake, Alexander and his Macedonians were convinced was nothing more than a tributary of the Tanias, which is their word for the Don, and that this river flowed into the Black Sea ultimately and marked the farthest limit of the inhabited world. At least that's what Aristotle believed and most Greeks. What they didn't realize is that there was this whole area of Central Asia beyond, and from there you enter into the world of China. So the Macedonian soldiers who had penetrated to the Jaxartes River had beaten all these nomadic opponents and Bactrians and Sogdians. They were suffering dysentery, they were footsore, but in 329 BC, as exhausted as they were, they thought that the victory was in sight and they were about to return to home. Unfortunately, what they didn't bank on is that Spitamenes and his associates expected Alexander to rule this region the way the great king had, that is, exact some tribute and go away. Instead, they saw the foundation of military colonies. They saw the Macedonians starting to regulate the northern frontier, and that meant the Sogdians and their nomadic allies rose in rebellion and then spread the war across the upper satrapies and delivered Alexander one of his toughest campaigns of all time. That is the pacification of Central Asia. And it would take some 2.5 years for Alexander to bring these regions under control and establish his position as great king of the East.